Then we have fruit. We know that fruit was a part of first fruits, that there was fruit that was presented to the Lord, because in ancient Israel, there were 7 different types of fruit in the land. I've got a replica of one of them here. This is called a pomegranate. Let me give you a little teaching about a pomegranate while I can. When you have a pomegranate, it's a beautiful red fruit. And in fact, I tried to do this one time and I just got tired of doing it. But Jewish tradition says in a fully mature large pomegranate, there'll be 613 seeds, because there were 613 deeds that Israel is commanded to do in the Old Testament. Now notice this, that up at the top of the pomegranate, it almost looks like it has a crown on top. And that is a crown, but it's a natural thing. And so on the garment of the high priest, right back here where I'm standing, the garment of the high priest, there's bells and pomegranates at the bottom. You can hear the bells and pomegranates at the bottom, because the pomegranate represented the fruit, the bell represented the noise of the worship. So you've got to have fruit between your worship. In other words, when you get out of church, you got to live what you've been saying. Amen. And so the crown and pomegranates, not natural ones, but they were carved out. There were 2 pillars that entered into the temple back in the Old Testament time, and the top of them had pomegranates carved, because it was a holy fruit, because of the 613 deeds found in the 5 books of Moses. Every Jew was to obey, and traditionally 613. I'm sure somebody one day sat down years ago and counted 613 seeds and put that together, but that's an interesting story nonetheless. All right, so let's go back to the fruit. I got on a rabbit trail there for a minute. According to James chapter 5:7, the fruit represents the souls that are on earth who need to be saved. The precious fruit of the earth, he calls it. The grapes, as we'll talk about later on, Revelation 14:18, represent judgment, which is coming to the nation. So you've got wheat, which are the children of the kingdom. You got the fruit, which are the souls of the earth. You got the grapes, which represent the judgment. And then in the parable of the wheat and the tares, you've got the tares that represent the wicked people, people that are motivated by Satan. Now in the harvesting, and I want to take my time here and really get this across to you, because we've got to understand this part to understand the next phrase of what we're going to share with you, or the next phase. In the harvest, there is a gathering process. And here's what the gathering process is. Listen carefully. First is first fruits. You mark the first part of the grain that's ripened and present that to God at the temple. That sanctifies the rest of the field. The second phase is the main harvest, where you harvest the main field. The third phase is called gleanings, in which there was wheat that was left standing in the 4 corners of the field. That was given to the stranger and the poor and the widow among the people. Let's go over this again. 3 phases of the harvest. First fruits, that grain that ripens first is separated, marked, and brought to the temple, and the rest of the field's not touched. Some of you already know where I'm going with this. The next phase of the harvest is harvesting the main wheat or barley that's ripe, and taking it to the threshing floor and preparing it to go into the barn. Then you have the 4 corners that remain. So you actually have, when you look at this, a beautiful picture that we're going to be sharing with you of how first fruits ties into the coming of the Lord for the church and the resurrection of that in Christ. The first fruits process are as follows. Now, let me go back to the other one. You mark the first fruits, you harvest the field, the corners remain. I call it marking, harvesting, gleaning. Marking, harvesting, gleaning. Now, in the first fruits process itself, you mark the first fruits with either a band or a red cord. They actually say it was a reed that was tied around it. Then you gather the first fruits in a bundle. Then you present the first fruits at the temple. We call this marking, gathering, presenting. Now some of you just start thinking ahead now with me about the rapture, and look at it again. Marking, then gathering in, then presenting. See how the picture of the first fruits of the harvest slowly begins to develop in understanding the picture of being gathered together in heaven to be with the Lord at His holy temple. First fruits are brought 2 times. There's the first fruits of the barley harvest, which is brought around the time of Passover. There is the first fruits of the wheat harvest that is presented fully in the form of 2 pieces of bread at Pentecost. And the first fruits has to be the first thing to leave the field to go into the temple. Now, I'm going to go back to something I said a moment ago talking about the church and the harvest, because we mentioned earlier how that there is predicted in the Bible a 7-year time frame, which most Bible scholars call the 7-year tribulation period. Now, in this period of 7 years, it always has intrigued me, the number 7, because the number of 7 is found many times, both in the Old and New Testament. It always represents a number of completion. It always represents a number of perfection. It's often been called God's perfect number. But the 7-year tribulation period is basically a time of 7 years when man is given complete control of the governments of the earth. When the Antichrist attempts to annihilate the Jewish people for the final time, he will not be successful. And it's a 7-year time frame of God's wrath and judgment being poured out on the earth. The first part is called the wrath of the Lamb. The last part is called the wrath of God. Now, the number 7 is important, but notice how the number of 7 comes into the feast. And I'm sharing this with you for a very important reason. First of all, you have Passover, and then you have unleavened bread. The Bible tells the Jewish people to eat unleavened bread for 7 days. Leaven in the New Testament represents sin. So unleavened bread represents something that has no sin in it. It represents purity. So for 7 days they were to eat unleavened bread. Now look at the second one here. When the priest was going to go into the Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, and celebrate that with the people, and the people were going to fast all day on the 10th day of the 7th month, which was the Day of Atonement. Did you know that the priest had to separate himself 7 days before into a chamber and hide himself from the people for 7 days before the actual Yom Kippur service? Did you also know that the Feast of Tabernacles, in which the Jewish people build a booth outside of their natural home, live, eat, and sleep in that booth, they do it for 7 days. At the conclusion of 7 days, they come right back into their natural home. Now, in case you haven't caught it, all these things are a picture of the 7-year tribulation in which the church will be with the Lord for 7 years. Because, well, let me go ahead and just share it, and then I'll explain why we're talking about number 7. You say, well, Brother Stone, this says 7 days of unleavened bread, 7 days the priest is in a concealed chamber, 7 days that they celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles. That's not 7 years. No, there is a principle in the Bible where a day represents a year. Now, I can prove this to you right here. Israel spied out the land for 40 days, fell into unbelief, and wandered in the wilderness for how long? 40 years. Why did God let them wander in the wilderness for 40 years? It says in Numbers chapter 14, here it is, after the number of the days in which you search the land, even 40 days, each day for a year, shall you bear your iniquities, even 40 years, and ye shall know my breach of promise. So in other words, for every day they fell in unbelief, they had to have a year that they wandered in the wilderness. It's called a day for a year theory.